News of the day.
Mr. Zimmerman, have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
With values that never die.
There are certainly a lot of controversies or scandals brewing right now when it comes to the Obama administration.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Dealing with the federal government is not always high-tech, and it's not always user-friendly.
The stories that matter.
This is a massive escalation in the tension here in Egypt.
The issues that count.
I don't know why the media tries to make this into a sensation. We have never hidden the fact that we supply Syria with weapons.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
He's got the red, white, blue flying high on the farm. Semper Fi tattooed on his left arm. Spend a little more in the store for a tag in the back of his.
Welcome to American Heartland. I am Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com, upholding values that are never, ever going to die. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, it is 4th of July weekend, and today we are going to do a special edition of American Heartland. We are going to talk about the big stories of the summer. All of the stories that we're going to discuss today have long-term trends affecting our nation, and we're going to discuss these in detail. First on our roster, a showdown brewing now between the legislative branch of Congress and the executive branch. The President of the United States is essentially conducting a unilateral presidency. He has decided that because he cannot forge a consensus in the House and he can't enact much of his legislation, he is simply going to do it with his phone and with his pen. In other words, he is going to ignore Congress and try to enact as much of his legislation as he can. The problem with this is that his agenda is at odds, in many cases, with the wishes of the American people. And the Republican-dominated House has blocked him. That is part of the way that is the way that the Constitution works. Now, if he were an intelligent man and a capable president, what he would do is he would say, like Bill Clinton did, and like others who faced major opposition in one of the branches of government, you say, well, I've got to find a way to get people on board so I can pass the legislation that is dear to me. This means I've got to make compromises. I've got to forge relationships. That's what you do when Congress is not abiding by the wishes of the president, by the desires of the president. It should be a give and take. That's what our founding fathers had deliberately created. And that ensures that we don't have arbitrary power, that we don't have a monarchy, that we don't have a dictatorship. Now, he is an expert on the Constitution, and he should well understand this. Instead, he's acting like a petulant child. But worse than this, in many of the executive actions that he has taken, and don't get me wrong, it's not a matter of how many executive actions that you take, because you have lots of his defenders saying, well, Bush and Clinton actually used more of the executive power than President Obama did. It's not the number of executive actions, it's the nature of executive actions. What this president is doing is he is enacting laws. He is enacting the power of legislation, the power that usually goes to the House and the Senate. He is appropriating their power for himself, and that has got to be struck down. So you now have this showdown between our branches of government, and it culminated this summer with the Speaker of the House deciding to sue the President of the United States. Listen to this.
You know, the Constitution makes it clear that the president's job is to faithfully execute the laws. In my view, the president has not faithfully executed the laws. We have a system of government outlined in our Constitution with the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Congress has its job to do, and so does the president. And when there's conflicts like this between the legislative branch and the administrative branch, it's, in my view, our responsibility to stand up for this institution in which we serve.
Could this lead to an impeachment proceeding against the president?
This is not about impeachment. This is about his faithfully executing the laws of our country. The economy continues to struggle. The president has no plan for economic growth and won't push his party to act on the good ideas that we've passed in a bipartisan fashion here in the House. The IRS targets a political opponent, lies about it, and the White House won't lift a finger to provide the truth to the American people. The VA's abuses continue to be revealed, and yet we still don't see a long-term plan for reform to VA. And not only does the president regularly ignore the law, he brags about it, and he brags about his willingness to change it unilaterally. First, this administration makes the wrong decisions, then it won't give the American people the straight answers. Instead, it's arrogance and incompetence right down the line. I think Americans deserve better, and the House will continue to listen to the American people and make their priorities our priorities.
You know, the irony is that in foreign affairs, the president always says that we need to work with other nations. We need to be multilateral. And yet, at home, he is a unilateral president. He thinks that if he wants something, he should just be able to get it. And he is trying to peg the Republican Congress as a do-nothing Congress. That is a lie. They have enacted a ton of legislation, and they send it forward to the Democratic-led Senate, and then the legislation dies there. So, the president has a leadership problem. He is unable to build a consensus. And instead of trying to fix his leadership problem, he violates the laws of the land. And Boehner is doing the right thing by saying this will not stand, because this is alarming to every independent, to every Democrat, to every citizen of the United States. Today it is the president who is a Democrat who is acting like a monarch or a dictator. Tomorrow it could be a Republican. So it is in everybody's interest to ensure that our Constitution works the way it was designed to work. And that's what Boehner is doing. Now, the reporter in that clip asked a very astute question. Can this lead to impeachment? Boehner is being very crafty, and he's saying, well, no. In fact, yes, it can lead to impeachment. Because what's happening across the land, you have an increasing body of people, an increasing number of people saying, this man is so out of control. His actions at home, he tramples on the Constitution, and abroad, he is a danger. He is a national security threat in many of his policies, which embolden our enemies. Therefore, there is a growing movement to impeach him. This is a measure that the House Speaker has wisely taken to at least let those of us who are calling for impeachment know that they are listening, they are taking notes, they are responding to this desire that we have to ensure that our president serves our nation faithfully. And he is laying the groundwork, possibly, if the Republicans can retake the Senate, to cast an impeachment vote. This president has crossed the line so many times. There is so much outrage out there, and that outrage is going to continue to grow as we see so many hard-fought gains that the American people have bled for, especially abroad, suddenly be dissipated under his tenure. So there are multiple problems that the president is confronting. He is losing the faith and the confidence of the American people. Recent polls show that they do not believe he can lead us going forward. And Boehner has rightfully, brilliantly, correctly taken a strong measure, sue the president, ensure that the courts strike down his unconstitutional action. And when they do so, that is going to be another pillar, another post in our impeachment drive. Now, the president, the nincompoop in chief, he still doesn't get it. And in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, he is saying that he has nothing to apologize for, and he doesn't really get the nature of this lawsuit. Check this out.
So he's gone around Congress using the president's executive power and setting up a new high-stakes battle with Republicans. And you've got Speaker Boehner talking about suing you for executive actions that he says has crossed the line. He says, we elected a president, we didn't elect a monarch or king.
Well, you notice that he didn't specifically say what exactly he was objecting to. I'm not going to apologize for trying to do something while they're doing nothing.
Even if he gets sued.
You know, the suit is a stunt. But what I've told Speaker Boehner directly is, if you're really concerned about me taking too many executive actions, why don't you try getting something done through Congress? The majority of American people want to see immigration reform done. We had a bipartisan bill through the Senate, and you're going to squawk if I try to fix some parts of it administratively that are within my authority while you are not doing anything?
Boy, he is thick as a doorknob. Really, his skull is thick, thick, thick. If Boehner has decided that he can't enact immigration reform, it is because you have a vociferous segment of the American population who are saying, no, we don't want this. We don't want immigration reform. Our borders are being swamped with illegals, and we don't think that giving any kind of amnesty, I don't care what you call it, amnesty by any other name, is going to fix the problem. So Boehner is responding to a vociferous, passionate part of the American population. And the president knows that. And as a leader, again, he doesn't get it. You can't enact legislation when you don't have a consensus. And so it's not that the Congress isn't doing anything. It's not that it's a do-nothing Congress. The Congress is trying to pass laws that everybody can agree on. And the president should be trying to foster that middle ground. That's how you get legislation done. But if the people oppose a particular path, don't blame Congress. It's your job to try to convince the people of the rightness of your policies. But if you don't have a big enough consensus, it can't get done. Period. That's the way the system works. He doesn't seem to understand the gravity of what's at stake here. This is not a stunt, Mr. President. This is the first shot leading to ousting you from office even before your term is up. And just to show how dense he is, he actually went around the country, he was in Minneapolis, saying that so many of the scandals that have outraged the American public, oh, don't worry about these, they're just phony. Listen to this.
But sometimes the news that's coming off is just, these are Washington fights. They're fabricated issues, they're phony scandals that are generated. It's all geared towards the next election or ginning up a base. It's not on the level. And that must feel frustrating. And it makes people cynical, and it makes people turned off from the idea that anything can get done. And if I've got one message today, it's the same message that I gave to that young mom that I mentioned, who I had lunch with before I came here, who wrote me a letter just talking about how she's done everything right, her and her husband, and she's working hard and raising 2 beautiful kids, and she has a great life, but it's a struggle, and wondering if anybody in Washington knows it. You know, what I told her is the same thing I want to tell all of you, which is, I know it. You're the reason I ran.
Apparently, he's trying to say that the plight of the struggling worker, the struggling middle class, is the reason that he is in Washington, D.C. The problem is he's had years to fix the economy, and the latest reports are damning. We now know that in the first quarter of this year, we had negative growth. And that is mostly due to Obamacare, which is crippling our economy. But an even larger point, an even more important point is this. He says that these are Washington fights, that these scandals are all part of ginning up somebody's base. Excuse me, Mr. President, the Veterans Affairs scandal has nothing to do with ginning up anybody's base. These are military men who died waiting before they got treatment. The IRS scandal, that was a Democratic maneuver to suppress the vote. That is threatening to every citizen of the United States, and you even have Democrats calling for a special prosecutor on this one. The NSA surveillance and Benghazi, all of these issues, they are not phony. They are real. They cut at the core of the concerns of the American people for their own welfare and, even more important, for their liberty. What the truth of this summer is that the president has had years to fix the economy, to heal the wounds in Washington, to unite the nation, and instead of bringing hope and change, he leaves us wanting him, begging him to get out of the way so we can get a competent, capable, truly caring, and truly patriotic leader in power. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that never die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome to a special summer edition of American Heartland. Today we are talking about the big stories of the summer of 2014. And this summer has been dominated by bad news in what appears to be a hopeless place, which is Iraq. After so much blood and treasure expended there, we now see the place falling apart. ISIS, an al-Qaeda offshoot, has gained tremendous amounts of territory. And this implosion in Iraq shows clearly that the president blew it. His Iraq policy is a complete failure. His conduct of the war on terror is a complete failure. This summer, we also witnessed the ghost of Bush and Cheney past, because as Iraq blew up, everybody started to debate once again whether Bush and Cheney had the right policies or the wrong policies. I have been very, very clear and unequivocal on this since we began the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq was a just war. It was a good war. It was the right war to fight. It was in our national interest. And Bush's agenda, his freedom agenda, was the only real option that we have to transform the Middle East and end this cycle of violence and terrorism that is coming for us. So that is the right policy, and it was all working just fine. If you think about what happened, as long as Obama was following the Bush and Cheney blueprint, we were winning. Remember that when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he said he wanted to withdraw the troops within 6 months. So he wanted to withdraw those troops in 2008, but he didn't do so. He waited. And essentially, he stuck to the blueprint that Bush had outlined, that we were going to end up withdrawing by 2014. So the situation was stable. We had seen historic democratic elections taking place in Iraq, which were the pride of that nation and the pride of ours. Things were working just fine until, guess what? Until the nincompoop in chief decided that he was simply going to withdraw and not leave a scintilla of American forces there. Nothing. No eyes on the ground. No boots on the ground. No American presence. And he and the Secretary of State have conducted interview after interview saying that these events they were just completely unpredictable. I mean, who could predict that the Iraqi soldiers would drop their weapons and drop their uniforms? You morons! Everybody could predict that. Everybody could predict that. You had our top military advisors saying that you needed to leave at least 20,000 American troops still on the ground, even after the end of the official end of combat, because the Iraqi army is still fragile. It's a new army. And as a historian, I can tell you this, and I think many Americans might not fully know it, because I didn't know it until I studied history. So I just want to emphasize it. The hardest thing to get an army to do is to stand there and fight. It is a very, very high level of civilization when you achieve a fighting force that in confronting death doesn't put down their weapons, doesn't remove their uniform and just walk away, that they actually stay there and fight for a principle that is larger than themselves. To achieve a disciplined army is extremely difficult, and it requires years and years and years of training and work, and it is also part of a larger code, a national code of civic virtue. So anybody that understands how a military works understands that if you're going to have Iraqi security services that are going to work well, it takes a long, long time. So Obama's military advisors understood that what was at stake. And they said, you've got to leave forces behind, because if something should go wrong, those troops are going to need reinforcements. They're going to need steel in their spine to fight for their nation, because all of this is too fragile. So ignore what the president and the Secretary of State are saying, that nobody could have predicted this. I'm sorry. Everybody predicted it. And everybody told you what you needed to do in order to prevent the collapse of the Iraqi army. Instead, the president decided that because he wants Iraq to be secure and stable, it must be secure and stable. Because he wants the war on terror to end, it must end. You see, because if it works in his imagination, then it must work in reality too. So he withdrew the forces, and he did not achieve an agreement with that government led by Maliki to ensure that there would be some kind of an American presence. And the excuse that he seized upon to be able to just cut and run is that Maliki wouldn't give our soldiers immunity. Listen, everybody knows that a new and fragile government like that had emerged in Iraq, that had emerged basically because of the American presence there, we can get anything we want. The president simply didn't want to fight to be able to leave combat troops behind, because he was afraid that his peacenik base was going to excoriate him. So instead of making a decision that was right for Iraq and right for America, what he did was he made a political decision that he thought would be right for him. And he cut and run, and now we have a situation in Iraq which is literally completely out of control. We now have at least 500 troops there. And the president has said, we don't want, combat troops. Mr. President, I don't care what you call these troops. I don't care if you call them special forces. I don't care if you call them military advisors. Again, you're playing with words. What we really have is American troops in harm's way, engaged in what is going to be a bloodbath there. And in addition to troops, we now have armed drones flying above Iraq, which means what? Which means, guess what, Mr. President? We're not out of Iraq. We're back in Iraq. And we're in it having lost crucial pieces of land and having now emboldened ISIS to the point that we don't know what it's going to take to resolve the situation at this point. We don't know how much more blood and treasure, either of Iraqis or of Americans, it's going to take. And I've been saying this from the start. I say this as a historian. One thing you have to know, if you're going to go into war, you never, ever, 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 ever conduct half measures in war, because that only makes the war bigger. War has to be swift, decisive, forceful, and conclusive. What does that mean? The definition of war is you use all and every means necessary to annihilate the enemy, period. The president doesn't get that because he prefers rules of engagement. He prefers winning hearts and minds. He prefers dancing in the mirror of his own illusions rather than dealing with reality of warfare and listening to the wise counsel of America's military brass. So, to make matters worse, the nincompoop in chief ignored everything that Bush and Cheney did, decided to go off on his own. Now we've got advisors back in harm's way. And recently he asked Congress, guess what? For $500 million to arm the opposition in Syria against Assad. So the nincompoop in chief hasn't quite grasped that currently ISIS, who is in Syria and who is taking over so much of Iraq, is accumulating American weapons that the Iraqi soldiers left behind. And this is going to make it harder and harder to defeat our enemies because now they are armed with our weapons. And what does the nincompoop in chief want to do to add to this? He wants to try to figure out which members of the Syrian opposition are moderates that we can give weapons to and train. And it doesn't seem to occur to him that all that's going to happen is $500 million worth more weapons and ammunition is going to fall into the hands of ISIS. In addition, he doesn't have any coherent strategy for the Middle East. You've got Assad, who is an Alawite, but he's part of a larger Shia alliance, basically allied with Iran. And Iran wants to help the Shia government in Iraq, Maliki. And Kerry and the president are talking about, well, maybe we need Iran's help. But at the same time, they're saying, well, we need Iran's help. But you know what? We may actually antagonize Iran because we're going to give weapons in Syria to the opposition that Iran doesn't want to oust Assad. I don't know if you followed any of this, but the nutshell is this. He does not know what he's doing. He does not know how to forge a coherent strategy, build a clear set of alliances. And all he knows how to do, half measures and waste American money, blood, and treasure, achieving nothing. Because what we face now, not only is Al-Qaeda not dead, as he promised in 2012, he said that Osama bin Laden was dead, that Al-Qaeda was receding, that America was essentially safe from terrorism. Al-Qaeda is stronger now than ever before, even though that name is ISIS. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's a global jihadist movement, and it is stronger than ever. It is even stronger than it was at the time of 9/11. When you have Democrats as commanders-in-chief, you always have major foreign policy disasters, catastrophes. And that's what we're seeing now in the Middle East. And I have to say, I'm disappointed in some members of the conservative wing who are giving this man a lifeline, the president, saying that the battle between the Shia and Sunni, that's all, it's all out of the president's hands. No, it isn't. We had stabilized the situation. And if Bush and Cheney had had a third term, I assure you, and I think everybody knows, we would not be seeing ISIS today trampling on all our hard-fought gains. Recently, Cheney has resurfaced, having to give interviews, and all of these interviews have one common thread, the thread of alarm. This is a senior member of America's ruling class that is saying, wake up, America, because this president is endangering our national security. In many of the interviews that he's conducted, he's had to explain what he and Bush did so well and how everything has fallen apart. It's fallen apart because the president of the United States is following a policy of retreat from the world instead of engagement. Listen to Cheney.
They are very good, very sophisticated, able to target individuals.
How do you feel about bringing Iran into the discussion about Iraq?
Bad idea. The Iranians are, in many respects, the common enemy for a lot of our friends out there. The idea that we're going to welcome Iran into solving the problem in Iraq is like bringing the Russians in to solve the problem in Ukraine.
As you understand it, what is the Obama doctrine in fighting terrorism?
Well, for starters, they don't believe there's a problem, or at least they act that way. They've said as much. They went from a situation where they got bin Laden in 2011, and then their attitude after that has been, well, we got bin Laden, problem solved. Secondly, he's been heavily involved in trying to withdraw the U.S. from the Middle East. They had all the story about a pivot to Asia. We got out of Iraq and didn't leave a stay behind force there. He's already announced he wants to do the same thing and get it totally out of Afghanistan. Afghanistan. The result of all of that is to significantly diminish the capacity of the United States government to influence events in that part of the world. I've got a lot of friends out there from the last 25 years, and to a person, Arab, Israeli, they all have lost confidence in the United States. They no longer believe they can count on us. A lot of what's involved in the Obama doctrine, I think, is to significantly diminish the capacity of the United States to influence events around the world. He's not decimating Al-Qaeda, he's decimating our own Defense Department.
He is decimating our ability to stand up to our sworn enemies. And Cheney is saying he has no reason to want to come forward and speak to the public other than to warn us all just how dangerous the situation abroad is becoming.
Why are you speaking out? I mean, it seems clear that you are on a kind of offensive to speak out about this. And you must realize, given how polarizing a figure that you are, that for some Americans, your criticism will only make President Obama more popular.
Well, he's going to need a lot more help than that to improve his current standing in the polls. But I'm convinced that the fate of the republic is heavily involved in these issues. And if I don't speak out, I don't know who else will. And I feel that I can speak with some credibility because I've been there, I've been involved in all those discussions and developments, and I feel very strongly that it's important to do it. I believe in it. I don't need to sort of re-engage in the political wars, but I really, really believe that we are in big trouble and that this president's not likely to get us out of it.
He speaks with authority and with the credibility of a plan that had succeeded, whereas the President of the United States has only failure on his hands. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that never die.
There's no going back.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. You're listening to a special edition of our show. We are talking about the big stories of the summer of 2014. This summer, one of the really big stories is that the mainstream media didn't cover the big stories. Isn't that funny? One of the big stories is that the mainstream media stopped reporting the news. I've got a confession to make. I've recently been watching the mainstream media. Yes, I'm guilty. As part of my extensive roster of reading and news watching, I decided to add every night, I'm also going to look at ABC News and NBC News. And why? Why am I doing that? Well, I want to see what they're reporting and what they're not reporting, and also how they're reporting certain stories. I want to understand what Americans who are watching the news are saying. And you know what I've discovered? That mainstream media is the airhead media. That's really what it is. Some of the newscasts begin with World Cup soccer. You know, I'm a fan of the Americans doing well at the World Cup, but that shouldn't lead the nightly news. And it's all about floods and national tragedies, trucks turning over on highways, people losing their home, all this stuff. Yes, it's important. but it shouldn't dominate the newscasts. And then, of course, at the end of every segment, there's some kind of a feel-good story, some child got an operation and was saved, and we should be so happy about that. So what is the nightly news? Basically, it's the airhead media for airheads by airheads. One of the things I've been especially looking for is this. When the news broke that so many of our veterans didn't receive care and died, that the President of the United States had vowed to fix the VA and then didn't, I was wondering, well, what are they going to do on the nightly news, on the airhead media? What are they going to do? And you know what they do? They cover it, but very, very quickly. So they'll say, and there's a scandal in the VA, and the Inspector General's report was scathing, on to other news. So one of the techniques is you report something, but you report it so quickly, and you report it between feel-good stories or between national tragedies of floods and earthquakes and who knows what, and you don't give it enough importance. I wanted to see, too, how are they going to report the fact? What are they going to say about something that is so damning? That the IRS lost 2 years' worth of Lois Lerner emails that just disappeared. The computer crashed. 6 other employees, all of it, they just vanished. Congress has been beating the drum on this. That's impossible. The IT division is saying those emails are somewhere. The National Archivists are saying the IRS broke the law, obviously. So there's obviously a cover-up. It's as clear as day. I wanted to see, how are they going to cover this? And they do one of two things. They either ignore it or they give it very, very little time. And to the viewer, if you give something very little time, it's the same thing as saying it's not that important. I watched a whole broadcast of This Week with George Stephanopoulos where they teased it very early on that they were going to discuss the IRS scandal and the disappearance of these emails. I waited and waited and waited and waited, and finally, almost near the end of the show, on the panel, they give it a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes. But how do they do it? They give it a minute with everybody weighing in, again, diluting the impact of what it all means. So what we're seeing this summer is the airhead media has dropped the ball completely on the scandals that are engulfing this administration. They are so wedded to protecting him that in the process, they are losing their own credibility. And I've never seen it as bad as this summer. This summer was even worse than the Love Fest of 2008 when they were celebrating Barack Obama. At least they were reporting what was going on. Now they are actually ignoring the news. And I wanted to see something else. How are they going to report the news that Boehner is suing the president? Do you know how Brian Williams reported it? He kept emphasizing the Republicans, the GOP-led House. He kept throwing that in there instead of discussing the litany of abuses of executive power that led to the House Speaker deciding to sue the president. So you have ignore, diminish, or distort. That's the mechanism of the airhead media. And the airheads love it. Oh, they love it because more and more, the ratings for ABC News, for example, are through the roof, especially in the youth demographic. The poor education in our society dovetails with the poor news now because the uneducated like airhead news. And that's a very dangerous cycle that we're embarking on. Because in order for our republic to survive, we need voters to understand the news, to understand the political scene. Only then can they cast an informed vote. Well, I know that Bill O'Reilly gets a lot of heat from diehard conservatives and from Tea Party folks. My view on him is that he's a useful commentator, which means I don't think he's always right. But I think sometimes he does the nation a great service. And one of the best monologues that he delivered was one that he did on his Talking Points memo, which leads his broadcast, on the utter corruption of the airhead media. he contrasted with statistics, with facts, the coverage of the Bridgegate scandal affecting New Jersey Governor Chris Christie with how they are covering the coverage that is bad news for Democrats. Listen to this.
You may remember New Jersey Governor Chris Christie being pounded by the national media for a controversy on the George Washington Bridge. A grand jury is investigating whether members of Mr. Christie's staff sabotaged traffic on the bridge to get revenge on a political opponent. The story is valid, and the network news went wild with it, devoting 112 minutes to the situation in the first week, 112 minutes. But when the VA scandal story broke, there was no coverage on the nightly network news broadcast for almost 2 weeks. No coverage. When the lost IRS email story broke, just 3.5 minutes combined on all the network newscasts. Unbelievable. That is a news blackout. On the newspaper front, the big three liberal papers, the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, printed 56 stories and commentaries about Governor Christie in the first week. 56. First week of the VA scandal, 2 stories. First week of the IRS scandal, 3 stories. You want media bias? There it is, beyond a reasonable doubt. So, if James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin were with us today, they'd be the lead guests on A Factor this evening. Because those men envisioned a fair press in America, a media that would inform the people, giving them honest information so they could make educated votes. But that's not what we have today. And that corruption in the media is greatly harming this nation.
It is indeed. Listen, when the Founding Fathers devised the Constitution, one of the provisions that they initially put in place was that only property holders should cast the vote, because they feared that those without a stake in a republic might ultimately use their power to plunder the resources of the wealthy. They feared the tyranny of the majority. Well, over time, we whittled that provision away so that everybody could vote. And in order for the republic to survive, if everybody's going to vote, those commentators who were advocating for one man, one vote did emphasize that the public needed to be educated and the press needed to do its job. But what we've seen over the course of the 20th century and then the early 21st century is that the public has become increasingly less educated and the media is not doing its job. And we are slipping towards what our founding fathers feared, which is that an uneducated populace will use their vote to plunder the wealth of the rich. And then you're going to slip into civil chaos, possibly civil war, because the have-nots will use their power to take away from the haves. The founding fathers saw that, because they had studied the constitutions, many of the failed constitutions of the ancient world. And they knew that creating and sustaining a republic was going to be extremely difficult in the long term. A responsible, free, and honest press is a key pillar of preserving individual liberties. What the airhead media has done this summer is they have crossed the line beyond the point of return. And I, for one, am sick of just talking about it. And I think what we need to do now is we need to put maximum pressure on the airhead media to start covering the news. I think we need to organize massive letter writing campaigns and protests in front of all of their buildings and be unrelenting. So much so to the point that the news becomes that the airhead media is not covering the news. We want that to be a news story that we force them to cover, that there are protests about their work. And I think this should be one of the great causes of our time, to transform our media. What they have done over time is they have slowly ousted the conservatives, the conservative reporters and commentators, and then they slowly ousted the capable, competent journalists as they did with somebody like Cheryl Atkinson, who was forced out of CBS News. They forced the competent people out, and what they're left with are nothing but the partisans. The partisans who are part of the Obama administration scandal cover-up. And you know what? We shouldn't let them take our news organizations away from us. We should fight to get those organizations back. We should fight to infiltrate, penetrate ABC News, CBS News, NBC, the New York Times and CNN, and reclaim them as pillars of responsible, capable journalism that serves the best interests of the American people, not a specific ideology. And unless we do that, we will not be able to properly ensure that the laws of our nation are upheld and that those who commit grave ill deeds are held accountable. You're listening to Dr. Grace, upholding values that are never going to die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Some people live for the fortune. Some people live just for the fame. Some people live for the power, yeah. Some people live just to play the game.
Welcome to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. You're listening to a special summer edition of the show where we're talking about the big stories of the summer of 2014. And this summer, we witnessed the gaffe-prone book tour. She made so many mistakes on her book tour. And the sales, which initially began quite strong, dwindled rather quickly. And guess what? It wasn't her book that ended up making the longest impression. It's another book that has soared to the top of the charts. It is called Blood Feud, written by Ed Klein, a credible reporter who has previously worked for Newsweek. He has excellent sources. And what did we discover in his book? A key passage on Benghazi. It appears that, and there's no question about it, the Clintons had to have given this information because they're the only ones who knew it. Ed Klein is reporting that on the night of the terrorist attack, the president and the secretary of state, that is in the Benghazi terrorist attacks, the president and the secretary of state had a 10 o'clock phone call. And during that phone call, it was the president of the United States who told her that he wanted her to lie to the American people and to blame what happened in Benghazi on a spontaneous protest and on a YouTube video gone wrong, on a YouTube video which got the crowds to be incensed and to attack the compound. That night, according to the sources cited in the book, she said she was very uncomfortable with this narrative, that she didn't want to go down that road, that she didn't think it was going to ultimately work. And yet, it appeared that the Secretary of State was faced with a conundrum. Either she was going to have to tell the commander-in-chief, no, I'm not going along with the narrative, resign, humiliate him, and possibly lead to the first African-American president in American history not being reelected in 2012, and then she would be blamed for that. Or she was going to have to play ball, and play ball with a strategy that she ultimately didn't agree with. By 10:07 p.m. that night, the State Department issued a statement that was released which blamed the Benghazi attacks on the spontaneous protest in the YouTube video. And from that moment on, her fate and the president's were sealed. They were sealed in this lie. Now, this book and this revelation is extremely important because at last, for the first time, we have confirmation that the talking points narrative came from the president himself. It was concocted in the White House, possibly by his advisors, but it's something that he accepted on that night. He transmitted it to the Secretary of State. He is ultimately responsible for the lies that were told about Benghazi. But does this mean that Hillary Clinton can get away with her complicity in these lies? Is it true what she is now telling us, that she had no choice that night? It is a bunch of hogwash. First of all, she could very well have told the President of the United States that she was not going to go along with that strategy, and that if he wanted to go along with that strategy, he and his team would be responsible for that part of the communication. That she could simply issue a statement expressing her sorrow about what was going on, etc. There's multiple ways you could handle it without going to the extreme of having to resign that night. She could have left the ball in his court. What she is telling us now is a lie about her particular situation. Because she did have options that night, as we all do when our superiors tell us to do something we think is morally apprehensible. It was her duty as Secretary of State to tell the truth to the American people. And if her commander-in-chief was telling her to lie, she should have stood her ground. But what I think is really happening is this. When Secretary Clinton heard what President told her to do, she might have thought it wasn't the best strategy, but she decided to go along with it. You know why? Because she realized that her fate and his were intertwined. That if he would be pinned with Benghazi, then she would be forever pinned with it. And she went along because she thought maybe it had a chance of working. And now that the president's poll numbers have imploded, she has given the green light to her sources to go ahead and talk, because she's desperately trying to save herself as this presidency sinks to the bottom. Again, cynical opportunism. She's not trying to set the record straight. She's trying to save her own political hide. But either way that you cut it, whether you went along because you didn't want to embarrass the first African-American president in American history, whether you went along to save your own political hide, you know what, Mrs. Clinton? What difference does it make? Doesn't matter why you went along. The point is you went along and you lied to the American people. And as a result, you have lost any moral standing in this country and any credibility to possibly lead us in the future in high office. So an explosive book, Blood Feud. It has all kinds of delicious details about the feud between the Obamas and the Clintons. And because of this feud, the Clintons are leaking like canaries, giving us very important information about just how corrupt and cynical our president truly is. Now, also this summer, a new cry is emerging, not just to impeach the President of the United States, but also to impeach Eric Holder. If we don't impeach him, it will be very difficult to get a special prosecutor to truly investigate the IRS scandal, for example, or even to fully get to the bottom of the VA scandal. We need special prosecutors, especially in the IRS scandal, because the IRS scandal is worse than Watergate. And unless we get a special prosecutor, the only person blocking that is Attorney General Eric Holder. So we desperately need that special prosecutor. And Ted Cruz is now leading the charge. If he won't do what the American people are demanding, then perhaps we will have no choice. Roll it.
The people have a natural and immediate remedy that is available in November every 2 years. This November, I am confident that the American people will follow the president's advice and demonstrate that they are angry about the abuse of power and even angrier about the partisan cover-up in which all 55 Democratic senators have actively aided and abetting. If Attorney General Eric Holder is unwilling to appoint a special prosecutor, if he insists on keeping this prosecution in the control of a major Obama donor, then Attorney General Eric Holder should be impeached, because the rule of law matters more than any partisan political party.
And there you have it. The cry is going out across the land: impeach the president, impeach the attorney general, impeach the airhead media, and ensure that Hillary Clinton never, ever gets her hands in high office again. This is a special edition of the summer of 2014. We've covered the top stories of our summer. Hope you're having a good one, and keep the fire for liberty burning in your breast. This is Dr. Grace, upholding values that are never going to die.
Well, if you ask me where I come from, here's what I tell everyone. I was born by God's dear grace.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.